FLM, wide open thinking, world-class work, and far-reaching results. Now with locations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C. A strategic marketing and communications company dedicated to serving clients who specialize in the business of agriculture and the life of rural communities.
I think we're going to have a great discussion here on young farmers, the infrastructure that they need, and the things that we can do in the Farm Bill to help get young producers the advantages that they're going to need to become someday's old farmers. And this is a topic that's particularly near and dear to my heart because a lot of my friends are some of the younger producers that we're going to be talking about here today. And in talking with my parents a week or two ago, I realized it was 35 years ago this year that they closed on the farm that they bought. My father grew up on a farm, but once upon a time, he had an engagement announcement in the paper with my mother, and a little while later received a phone call from a farmer that didn't have any children, was looking to get out of the business, and long story short, my parents were able to acquire that farm. My cousin had a very similar situation unfold. His father was a realtor, knew of a farmer that was looking to buy a house in the Black Hills of South Dakota and retire. He asked, what are you going to do with your land? Long story short, my cousin was able to acquire that farm. So a lot of people are able to fall into some good situations to acquire land and acquire places where they can practice their agriculture, but not everyone is so lucky. And so I think we're going to have that discussion about what do we do to help producers get started, and not only the agricultural side of things, but the rural development, the rural side of life things. How do we get that infrastructure in place? How do we make sure there's adequate health care, adequate entertainment, and things like that? So I want to introduce our panel before we get going, and I'll start on my far left, your far right. First one is a familiar face to many people in this room, Krista Harden, who serves as the Vice President of Public Policy and Chief Sustainability Officer for DuPont. Before then, as many of you know, she was the former Deputy Secretary for the Department of Agriculture, also spent some time as the CEO of the National Association of Conservation Districts after about a decade on Capitol Hill. Seated to Krista's immediate right is Laura Batcha, who is the CEO of the Organic Trade Association, and OTA is an organization that coordinates about 8,500 member companies promoting today's $43 billion organic sector. And to Laura's right is Travis Medine, who is a fifth-generation sugarcane farmer from the state of Louisiana, where he farms with his dad and his brothers. He is also a director for the American Sugarcane League. And finally, last but not least, to his immediate right is Ryan Quarles, the commissioner for the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. He is also the leader of the Communications Working Group for the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. He is also, fun fact, the youngest statewide elected official in the United States, in addition to being a tractor pulling champion, I might add. But for the first question, and Krista, I'll start with you on this one. I ran through those scenarios at the beginning of my little spiel here about how my parents were able to luck into that farm. A lot of people are able to work their way into the family operation. But how can we, as agriculture, how can the Farm Bill help people that maybe aren't so lucky, that don't inherit a farm or don't marry into one, but yet would still like to be involved in production agriculture?
I think it's the probably the question, because I think it's very tough, and I don't think it's just the Farm Bill. I think that's a good start. There's certainly the last Farm Bill, I think it expanded a lot of programs, creative programs, loan programs that were developed that helped crop insurance, safety net type programs that really did help folks wanting to come to the farm who didn't have those kind of backstop, like a family already there. But I don't think it's just that. I think the Farm Bill is going to have to look at more creative ways, but also all of us in the private sector as well. And, frankly, it's not just young people. We're going to need everyone, right? We all know the average age of the American farmer. We know the shrinking population. We've got to think about our veterans. We've got to think about folks maybe second careers who are coming back into agriculture. People maybe like me who left the farm to make a living and been doing this for a long time and want to come back. Making sure there is a door, the doors are open to help them. And we look at the broad spectrum of agriculture and maybe be a little more creative. Looking also at the markets, what can the market supply? So I think I'm hoping that us starting this conversation now for the Farm Bill gives us the opportunity to not think like we always have and not just look for traditional policies and programs that may have been enough in the past. We're going to have to think more creatively and look for new ideas and also involve the private sector. I'm in the private sector now, and I think we have a role as well. So I'm hoping that maybe we'll start that discussion today, but it's going to go a lot further.
Thanks, Krista. And Laura, as we look at the organic sector and how they try and promote the young farmers, beginning farmers, and ranchers, how can the Farm Bill help, or how can USDA agricultural programs help with some of those beginning farmers and ranchers, particularly in the organic sector?
Thanks. I think, as a fast-growing sector of agriculture and food, one of the fastest in the country, we're acutely aware about planning ahead and long-term planning around supply chain needs, because our market's growing fast, and so we've got to invest in all those things we're talking about in terms of infrastructure and research to secure a supply for the future. Our beginning farmers come from a few different places. So we have new farmers that have never farmed before, people coming back to the farm, but we also have existing farmers that aren't using organic practices that come on over to organic as an opportunity. So we have to look at programs in terms of beginning organic farmers from multiple vantage points and gateways in, and be thinking about it that way. But when I take a step back and think about the Farm Bill and our policies as a whole, and I agree with Chris, it's in the Farm Bill and outside of the Farm Bill, I'm thinking about it from sort of a macro succession planning perspective. And when you do succession planning, you have to sort of take a step back and analyze the situation, but you have to be willing to be creative and invest in some things that might not be the immediate burning thing that is banging down your door at that moment. And that takes discipline, and it takes really being committed to solving the problem long term. And I think as we think about the Farm Bill debates, we have to think that way, because there are immediate pressing needs right now for farmers in terms of farm income and risk management that we're acutely aware of. But in order to succession plan, you have to be willing to put part of your brain over here and say, but we've got to solve the problems long term at the same time.
Travis, from your perspective of someone that's actively involved in production agriculture, what can USDA and the Farm Bill do to help you out and to help future generations that will come after you?
I think what it does is it addresses the big picture issue. So you look at a Farm Bill, and it's kind of the umbrella that everything else falls underneath, and as specialty crops or however you may fall, for instance, with sugar, we're always looking at a market for safety. And we need that safety, and it's provided in the Farm Bill as long as it's not compromised. It was compromised by Mexico a few years ago. We were able to correct it. And we like the way our program works, so we need that program to continue, because not only do we need a constant kind of flow to go along with, but to attract any future generation, you have to have some kind of continuity. And for that continuity to be there, those big picture items need to be in place. And once that big picture is there in place, and we can kind of provide the next generation a template, for lack of a better term, to work under, then we could see that. And perhaps I could see me and Kate's boys be the 6th generation of Medine Farms.
Commissioner Quarles, as you look at what your state is trying to do to help beginning producers, what can you use in terms of help from a Farm Bill and from a Department of Agriculture to help Kentucky's beginning producers be successful?
Well, of course, access to capital for new and beginning farmers has to be a priority. It does not need to discriminate against small and beginning farmers. That there needs to be opportunity and access in the new financial instruments that are available through FSA. And I think FSA needs to play a greater role when it does come to succession planning. I think a recent statistic that I saw is only about maybe a third of U.S. farmers have a succession plan in place. There's a lot of land. We're about to enter into a 20-year period. It's going to have the greatest land transfer perhaps in our generation in the next 20-year period. There's a lot of people wanting to farm that don't own it, and there's a lot of people coming into agriculture. There's so much of a renaissance type of attitude with some young millennials who want to get into agriculture but did not grow up on a farm. And so they're trying to get into creative land leases that may be multi-year with an option to buy after 10. There needs to be that sort of support from our policymakers. In Kentucky, we recognize the lack of capital for beginning farmers. And so we actually took part of our tobacco settlement money. I grew up in a tobacco state. I grew up on a tobacco farm. And as that area declines, my state had no choice but to reinvent its agricultural economy as we went from 80,000 tobacco farmers down to about 4,000 now. And so we had no choice but to diversify. And so we actually took some of those assets and placed it into what's called now the Kentucky Agricultural Finance Corporation. And we actually have a $60 million bank that is run through the Department of Agriculture that I chair, and half of our loan portfolio is dedicated solely to beginning farmers. And what happens is these young people may be working with their traditional ag lenders, and they can leverage up to a $250,000 loan at a 2% interest rate through us. And we have a very, very low default rate with that. We do a lot of vetting. But what that does is that it allows a beginning farmer to invest in, say, the poultry operation or the horse industry, which is unique to Kentucky. And it kind of gives those young folks not only a financial instrument that is supportive, but it also leverages other financial instruments that currently exist and hopefully will continue to exist in the next Farm Bill.
So a lot of interesting points that were brought up there, and I want to circle back to something that Laura said. Laura, you had mentioned that a lot of there was conversation within the organic industry that you guys aren't always looking at your beginning producers as people that are just beginning in the industry. A lot of times there's folks that transition into organic production. So how does a Farm Bill and how does United States agricultural policy, what's the proper way to approach that broad spectrum of people that could be beginning not only in your industry, but as Commissioner Quarles was addressing, sometimes there's people that are just wanting to get into agriculture, be them millennials or otherwise. What's the proper way to address that with the varying needs that those different groups of people are going to have?
Well, I think, am I still? Yeah, I think a lot of the needs, at least in terms of organic, are common across the groups. I think with the new farmers coming in and folks looking to expand their operations, one of the acute ones is obviously the access to land and the capital and the long-term leasing. We just did a survey with producers and handlers across the country, and that absolutely rises to the top. And that's a challenge that you can't work around really at all. In addition to that, so the things that we're talking about, what we hear is infrastructure, and it's specific infrastructure within organic, because once you get into the organic market, you have a different supply chain that you have to enter into. The place where you bring your crops may not take organic crops, and so there's a supply chain issue related to infrastructure that's unique in organic. But investing in that infrastructure development with a role for the private sector, absolutely, but finding a way to utilize the Farm Bill programs alongside that with programs that use private matching grants, et cetera. If you help build the infrastructure in regional communities, it allows the farmers in those communities to consider getting into organic. It makes it easier for folks starting up in agriculture. And some recent studies coming out of Penn State University show that when you have a cluster of organic operations that are surrounded by counties with other clusters of operations, they call it a hot spot for organic production and handling, it increases the mean household income in those counties by about $2,000 a year. So if you could do a little bit of an investment to help get the market moving, because nothing exists in a silo, and particularly for organic, you have a whole supply chain that you need to maintain intact. Some modest investments there open up areas for the opportunity to folks so that everybody doesn't have to solve the supply chain issue themselves.
And Crystal, I'll go to you with this next one. There are a variety of programs that the Department of Agriculture already has on the books to help out beginning producers. I should have mentioned in your introduction, you really led the charge of implementing this last Farm Bill, the 14 Farm Bill. So from your perspective and from what you learned through that implementation process, those current programs that are on the books, do you think they're working?
It's hard for me to even believe we're talking about the next Farm Bill. It seems like we just finished the last one, but I guess that is the process, right? I think they are working. I think they have. I think, I'm not as close to it now, obviously, but I think 75% of the microloans went to new and beginning farmers. So they are, and expanding the loan program so they can be used for land, I think is also another positive thing. The safety net whole farm insurance made a big difference for a lot of small folks. There's other things that need to be done. Definitions need to be consistent. I think for crop insurance, a new farmer is defined as 5 years. For the loan programs, it's 10. Those are kinds of things. Obviously, there's some costs there involved in that, but looking at consistency. So a new person, a new producer wanting to go into agriculture walks into an office, they're getting messages that make sense to them. The website is something I'm really proud of that we started at USDA when I was there for new and beginning farmers, an interactive process so you can actually plug in your information, where you live, what you're interested in growing, and then get, some direction on the tools and the programs that are out there, not only from the federal government or state government, but also Farm Credit System, Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, other partners that might offer support. I think those kinds of things can be enhanced. Those are easy things to do. That's the low-hanging fruit. But you really have to think about the investment and whether we are willing, as taxpayers, as the ag industry, to invest in more dollars for new and beginning farmers. Land is expensive, equipment is expensive, getting started. If you don't inherit, if you don't just walk into it and have those kind of supports, it is almost impossible. So the land, not only succession planning, but land transfer. There are a lot of farmers now, farm families who don't have an obvious successor. My family's one of them. My sister and I probably are not going to farm ourselves. So we're thinking creatively already about what do we do to keep the land in our family, but maybe helping someone, maybe a cousin, a niece, or a nephew, maybe someone outside of our family to make this land transfer, and having the ability to do that in a careful way, in a way that's not so prohibitive because of taxes, and other really limitations for that transfer. I think we have to look at all those kind of tough issues.
Travis, as someone that's actively working in production agriculture right now and working, maybe if you're not actively using the programs currently, just in conversations with the people that are, I mean, are there any of those changes that Krista talked about that you think would be a good idea? Or what do you think might need to change about the Department of Agriculture's approach to beginning farmers?
I think there are always things to be tweaked, but let me start by saying I think everybody in this room agrees that any investment in a young farmer is a step in the right direction. We're taking a step in a positive direction by doing that. That being said, a lot of young people who are using these programs are using them to supplement. This program is not going to take and purchase a farm for you. It's going to help you. It's going to help you along the way, whether it be in production or acquiring a new piece of equipment or a new parcel of land or whatever it may be. So I think we need to look at these things differently, and that it's not necessarily funding a farmer to get into business, but it may be a supplement to what they're already doing. I think it goes back again to the policies that we look to in the Farm Bill. We need those policies to be sound enough that someone can start working a business plan as they start implementing these things into their particular operation. I was fortunate enough to, while I disagree with what you said about walking into it, I didn't quite walk into it, I kind of drug my knuckles into it. But I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And on a farm our size, we had to grow, and we had to use economies of scale to change the way the operation worked. If my grandfather was still alive and could see what we did today, he'd be amazed. And so I think that next generation of farmers does need not necessarily a handout, but a help up. They just need a little bit of help, and I think these programs are a step in the right direction. Can tweaking be done? I think certainly, anytime there's anything like this being implemented. And I think it takes farmers coming to the table to be able to talk to, whether it be Congress people or in a summit situation like this. I think that's where it needs to begin.
Commissioner Quarles, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. Do the producers that would be eligible for these programs, and maybe the people that could be solid candidates, do they know what's available to them, and are they taking full advantage?
I think those who are well familiar with the farm community do know about it, but I think that this new entry of millennials who may not have grown up on a farm, they need to be educated. They need to know about the resources that are available and know about the farm loan program, which has had a 10% increase with beginning farmers in my state since the 2014 Farm Bill. So I would consider that a success. That's a success. There is a utilization rate that's higher than if it had not been there. But at the same time, we're dealing with millennial generation. There's more millennials in the United States than there were baby boomers at its peak. You're dealing with a generation of people born from the beginning of the 1980s to the mid-90s. These folks might know what a rotary telephone looks like. Okay, there is an institutional knowledge gap with connecting these folks with traditional farm programs. They just may not know about it, or if they can't find it on a quick Google search, or there's not an app for that, they may keep moving forward and not even know about it. But one thing I do worry about is that there is a generation of farmers out there that have seen some pretty good years, but they don't know what the 1980s were about, because a lot of them weren't born then. And I'm afraid that they may be over-leveraging themselves right now and not be adequately prepared and may not have the liquidity that it takes to go through some tough years. And that's what I'm worried about. And we talked about land transfer a lot already, and I think we're going to have to get creative on this. You know, there's the rise of the B Corp legal entity. Our state just passed it. I think about 35 states have it. You're actually seeing a lot of these young agribusinesses incorporate themselves as B Corps, and yet we're not sure if that is recognized in certain areas of federal government. And so I'm just trying to tell these folks, you got to be prepared. And if nothing else, if a family farm that is expected to move down to the next generation does not have a succession plan, they're setting themselves up for failure. There's the 3 Ds that divide up family farm. It's death, disability, and divorce. And all of those can be adequately prepared for with a solid succession plan that is planned out. Because if you think when you pass away and your farm is just going to magically go along and be well operated among your two boys or sons or young women, you're in for a rude awakening. All this can be prevented, and we've got to figure out a way to make access to land a little bit easier for those who did not grow up on a farm.
So a lot of the conversations that we've had so far have been specifically at the on-farm level, but I want to go a little bit broader than that and go out into rural America as a whole and look at some of these smaller towns, some of the communities that support a lot of these farm operations, but some of those communities are drying up, as we all know, as well. So what is it going to take to lure young people that are maybe looking to plant some roots, buy a forever home, and look for a place to live for a long-term period of time? What's it going to take to lure those people to rural communities and make them think that it's not only a good place to have a low cost of living, but it's a good place to, live? And I'll open that up to whoever would like to jump on it.
I think that's a tough one. I was voted most likely to leave in my senior class. My mama hates when I say that, so anybody tell her I brought it up again. It was a long time ago, but it was opportunity. I mean, it's a tough time. It was the 80s. It was a very tough time in agriculture. My little town suffered because the farmers suffered. And we did not have the opportunities, and that has changed somewhat. We've had new industry come in to my small town, and a lot of it's agribusiness, but there is some more local and regional operations, kind of things that Laura was just talking about that I think also give opportunity, but healthcare, education, just quality of life issues. So, our young people growing up in a small town should have opportunities like their cousins and counterparts in big cities. Maybe not at the same level, but there should be more opportunity. And I think it has to be a conscious decision. We have to think about this and invest and say that it is important that broadband is available, that other opportunities are available. There are jobs for spouses who may need to work off the farm or want to work off the farm, that kids can get a good education. All these things are not just going to happen unless we do have this conversation and, again, we make the investment.
So what's the answer here? Are we looking at more money for rural development grants? Are we looking at more targeted programs? What's the right approach here, do we think?
I think we need to look to strengthen not only the programs that we already have, but to look a little bit forward, because I am one of those examples where I work in rural America and my wife works in town. And we can see through the people we talk to, and not only that, through the people I went to school with, how many people left the city because they want to be an equipment dealer, because they didn't know that existed. They didn't know that opportunity was there. Well, with good sugar policy, we were able to support those dealers. When if that policy were to go away, who knows how many jobs would be lost besides the 16,000 we can count in Louisiana. So I think it comes down, again, and I hate to keep bringing programs up, but that's what it comes down to, the strength of those programs and where rural America can look to their leaders and say, please continue this strength that you've shown through your leadership.
I'll add to this as well. My children were raised on our very small farm in Vermont. They both live here in Washington, D.C. So they didn't view it as an opportunity, as Krista said. And I think I want to talk a little bit about some of the quality of life issues, because I think there's that, and I think there's the off-farm job opportunities is key that you raised, because folks want to have a place to raise families. They want to have confidence in their schools. That's like first. If you want to have family, you have to have confidence in your schools. You want to be able to go to the movies. You want to have a peer group and some friends. You want to be able to go to dinner and have some culture, however you define that in your community. So I think it can't just be the farm itself working. It has to be the whole small town working in order for it to be attractive. So sort of farm prices or commodity prices are not enough to, I think, revitalize small towns. It makes me interested in the things that I think organic is one good example of this, but certainly not the only or the panacea, but things where our data shows that when the producers and handlers, again, cluster together, the economic output, the activity there is enhanced even further, and that creates more money in a community so that people go to the store more and they shop more, and then these things just roll and steamroll on each other. So I think thinking about the value add and the ways in which producers and handlers work together to sort of stimulate in hubs and regions, I think is very important. And I think that is a role that there's an aspect of it that the Farm Bill can play in, because you can stimulate some of that through loans and grants and research and targeting regional areas. But I think to really get there, it's more than just about the income or the profitability on the specific farm. It's about there being enough in that whole community to make you want to raise your children there.
And one big aspect of people maybe being a little bit hesitant to live in rural America is, and this is going to be a very millennial thing to say, but my goodness, the internet is terrible. Every time I go home to my parents' place for Christmas, I pretty well plan on having a bit of a struggle responding to emails for a week, and just that's just something that we're going to have to work through. And so a lot of people are very concerned about getting good rural broadband. And for the video component of this series, we talked to a couple of producers near the Manassas, Virginia area, so just kind of a stone's throw from DC, and they were saying that they were in decent shape when it comes to rural broadband because of their proximity to the nation's capital. But obviously, as I'm sure we all well know, not everyone is so lucky. So Commissioner Quarles, I'll start with you on this. I mean, what's it going to take for rural broadband to be realized as an important factor in all 50 states, or do you think it already is realized?
No, I think there's plenty of room for improvement. We've got to view broadband internet the same way that U.S. federal policymakers viewed electrifying the United States post-Depression. I mean, we got to have it. It's not sufficient. It must be necessary. I think this is an area where rural development can really play a big role in this administration. I had a meeting with Secretary Elaine Chao this morning about rural infrastructure needs, and we talked about internet being a vital component of the farm economy. I mean, in fact, with modern equipment, you almost have to have it to run your machines. And if you have access to internet, that allows, if you're in a situation where you have a spouse that's working to support your bad habits of farming, they can telecommute. And, you got to have that opportunity. And that also leads into quality of life, lifestyles. If you're living in a community that does have a lack of internet, that affects your entertainment. And to get young people back to rural America, you really got to do two things, I think. You have to sell what's great about rural America, and that's the quality of life. We all know that farming and ranching, it's not an occupation, it really is a lifestyle, because you're putting in more than 40 hours a week. And, if you find those folks that are interested by that hard work, the country life, you need to capitalize on that. And one way you can do that is to continue to invest in the premier youth agricultural organizations that already exist, namely 4-H, FFA, and then even Farm Bureau has some great youth development programs. And those are the ways to identify those individuals from a young age, get them exposed to agriculture, tell them it's more than just plows, cows, and sows, that it's about engineering, math, technology, and science, to get them in the mindset that this is a career, it could be profitable, and it's an area of innovation that we not only need, but we're expecting the next generation to rise to the challenge to accomplish.
And as a reminder, I want to just remind everyone in the crowd that we are going to be taking some audience questions as part of this. And I know this crowd is not particularly shy, so by all means, feel free to write your questions down, hold them up in the air. We'll have some folks running around taking your cards. But I want to go to you, Travis, on this rural broadband question. I mean, the state of internet connectivity, how is it on your operation?
It's certainly necessary. It's absolutely necessary, and I think we need to look at it as part of the broader infrastructure discussion. But at the same time, we can't forget about the traditional infrastructure, because I'm lucky enough to sit on the board at the Port of Greater Baton Rouge and get to see what kind of investment it takes to keep a port of that magnitude and how important that is to the farming community, not just in my area, because that grain and feed comes from everywhere around the country to be distributed in the mouth of that river. Where I'm at, that's our lifeblood, is that river. And I'm also have the misfortune of having to travel a corridor with tractors and equipment on my farm that sees 100,000 cars a day. And I have to navigate that with tractors, equipment. My farms are 45 miles apart. So when I do that, I'm uniquely aware of the infrastructure problem we have. Being in South Louisiana, I mean, anybody that's ever been to Baton Rouge, be it on a game day or anything else going on around town, you know how bad traffic can be when you come to Baton Rouge at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So the infrastructure certainly needs to be addressed, but broadband needs to be a part of it, because the one thing that our millennial generation has brought to the farm is we've brought that new connectivity. We can communicate in ways that, like I say, if my grandfather could see the way I could handle bills and things like that from the seat of a tractor, I mean, they would be absolutely blown away at some of the things that we can do if the resources are there and if they're prioritized correctly.
Laura, thoughts on the combination of broadband and infrastructure as the broader picture here?
Yes, I don't think you can have a revitalized rural community that is going to attract young people to it without high speed. I mean, it's just not going to happen. I think entrepreneurs take smart risks, but they're not going to take a risk setting up shop someplace where they don't have good, reliable access to the internet. You know, now it's been a few decades, but back on my farm in Vermont, I had a small handling operation that at one point I sold to a larger company that was out of state. I maintained the farm and they owned the handling thing, and we had this like co-business. Well, we did the business transaction. It became quickly apparent to them that I didn't have any really reliable access to the internet. This is a town of 500 people and dial-up internet. Well, they invested money in getting me this like crazy line, because this was like they couldn't fathom doing anything without it. Well, within about a year, I had everybody in my neighborhood lovingly hacking into my line, because I was like, the word got out that I had speed. And I think, you know, for places where you haven't gotten beyond that yet, it's just essential. And for doing business, yeah, it's essential. And efficiency, productivity, everything.
And Krista, I'll direct this last question of mine to you, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. But from your perspective, as someone that used to work in the public sector, now working in the private sector, you're uniquely qualified to answer this one. But the Department of Agriculture invests a lot of money into research. But I'm wondering, is that investment an adequate amount of investment into research? And
No.
Okay.
Hear, hear.
It's a quick answer there. But what do you think? Are we leaving rural communities behind because of the confirmed lack of investment in agricultural research and making it a little bit harder for them to turn a greater profit, do you think?
Clearly, I think so. I feel strongly. I don't think we have made the commitment that we should in research. And, I work for a company now that invests a lot of dollars in research as well. There's a lot of, public investment is also still needed, even though the private sector is there. And certain things like broadband, where it is very expensive to provide broadband into a remote area. It just is. And the private sector is not always going to make that investment to go that extra. It's not just a mile, it's miles. In some states, where to get to a small enclave, a small community, an individual farm that deserves it just as much as their suburban and urban neighbors do, or even small towns. So I think there is definitely that investment that's needed, and the research for all elements of agriculture is still needed, and we will be behind. We are not now. I still think we're the most productive country in the world. Our farmers, I'd put them up against anybody. They're the best, there's no doubt. But they need to be looking ahead, not just worried about today. They've got to be planning, looking at what's coming down the road, whether it's new pests, diseases, whatever might be coming, new challenges they're going to have to deal with. And our research should be helping us stay ahead of that. And I'm afraid right now that we're not. And I think there was a commitment in the last Farm Bill with the new foundation. We'll be interested to see how that continues to develop and grow, hopefully. But I hope this Farm Bill will look at what was started in the last Farm Bill and make some enhancements and improvements.
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
For a moment? I think absolutely the importance of research. I think we need to also be thinking about diversifying the research portfolio that we invest in, if we, as it ties to this conversation about beginning farmers and and rural development. We need to be investing in the diversity in agriculture that we know the places that are attracting new farmers and young folks to come back into food and agriculture. We need to put money behind that in terms of research investment. There's a flagship program, the Organic Research Extension Initiative. It doesn't have baseline, and those programs become at risk. And if young folks are opting in there more than agriculture as a whole, the data shows that organic farmers are statistically about 5-7 years younger than non-organic farmers. We need to invest in the research for those value-added types of agriculture. Specialty crop research is another example of that. So I think if we want to see research as a tool to solving this problem, we need to be willing to think about investing our resources in a way that diversifies that portfolio.
I think going to that, I think Louisiana is proof positive of that, because when you look at a map, a lot of people in this room probably don't know that Louisiana is the northernmost point in the world where sugarcane is grown. One of the mills I personally send half of my crop to is the northernmost mill in the world. That came through research. Research that allowed us to grow a sugar plant that is as efficient as anybody else in the world, and we grow it in 10 months. And everybody else takes them 16 or 18 months to grow it. And we do it in 10 months, and we do a really good job. We feel like we can compete with anybody. But that research has to continue. That's constantly changing. There are constant pests involved, evolving, and things of that nature. So we need that investment, and we need it from the government as well. We can do private government partnerships, and we've done that in Louisiana with the American Sugarcane League. It's a league that I belong to. I'm a director on the board. We try to match as many dollars as we can through farmers investing back in research, but it's hard to do when the margins are so low. So we do need that help from the government. There's no doubt about it. I think those are all great points.
And I must say that as a member of NASDA and chairman of the communications group, that having a robust research funding component in the next farm bill is a priority for the Association of State Departments of Agriculture. And that's something that we're already advocating right now with our federal delegation. And it's important to realize that innovation requires resources. And just like in your home state, no-till corn was invented in Kentucky because of a cooperative, I guess you would call it today a P3 initiative between farmers, cooperative extension, and our researchers. And that has changed the world. It's changed conservation. And it happened on some western Kentucky farms. And it's also through that same sort of research component where we turned a tobacco plant in my state into what some would consider the cure for Ebola, the Ebola vaccine. And that happened through investment through higher education, investment through federal government, but also it helped train those future researchers to go off in the private sector and do this. And so it has to be a vital component of the next farm bill.
So great conversation, absolutely. I'm going to move into some audience questions, and we're going to start with one that admittedly is going to be kind of a tough question in more ways than one, I think, but it's something that's certainly impacting rural America and was a particular project for Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack before he took a job in the dairy industry. But the question relates to small towns and rural communities across the country, particularly in that Rust Belt section of the world, particularly dealing with the threat of drugs and opioids. What's the best way through policy, be it Farm Bill, be it something else, to address that threat in terms of the health of rural communities?
My state's not unique, but we've been eaten up by prescription drug abuse, but then that has turned into abuse of opioids. And I think that we have to have a serious conversation about criminal justice reform in the United States and the role of recovery and treatment centers for those who are suffering from addiction. There's been several companies that have come to Kentucky, some agribusiness companies that have looked at our state to locate, but they can't find a workforce that can pass a drug test. And that's a shame, because that's an economic opportunity that's going somewhere else, because we continue to struggle with this. And so I think that on the state level, when I was a legislator before an ag commissioner, we worked on this issue, and we worked about focusing on the addiction element of this and helping giving people a second chance.
I would just add, I think you hit it right on the treatment centers. I mean, I think that rural areas are very much in a deficit compared to other neighbors, but that is treating the problem after it is a problem. And so I think we do have to look collectively as a public, as the taxpayers, and looking at where the investment is, where the problem is, and whether it's medical, whether it is a criminal justice system. I think the answers are much more complicated. There's not a one fix, and I don't know if there are really Farm Bill issues, except maybe making sure there is rural development dollars there to help with treatment centers and others once the problem has been identified in a community. But also education. There are other factors that I think, and opportunity. So maybe there's opportunity. Folks don't get so downtrodden and so desperate at times. So I hope we look at this holistically.
So if this is not a Farm Bill issue, if it's perhaps best addressed through criminal justice reform or something else, how can rural America flex its muscles on something that maybe isn't specifically an agricultural issue? I mean, do you think the coalition is broad enough that it can maybe make enough noise on something that, as we've said, might not be a Farm Bill issue?
Well, I think, to Chris's point, there's an aspect of it that is a Farm Bill issue, and I'm by no means an expert, so my apologies in advance to medical experts when I step in it on this. But I look at my own experience, and what I didn't say earlier when I talked about my children being here in Washington and not staying there is, if you talk to them candidly, what they would tell you is there are few friends that left. A good percentage of them ended up with drug problems, and that's not attractive to them to stay in a place where that's going on, and that would just be their candid assessment to you. So I think aside from medical issues and criminal justice reform and all this stuff, I think long term you can't discount opportunity in rural communities, and what leaves people feeling desperate or without things worth investing their time in. So, I would just share that, but I would hope that rural communities could come to the table on that. But it's one of those things, actually, I think that, the coalition is a rural-urban coalition because there's so many commonalities there. It's not just a rural issue.
Yeah, as a policymaker, I don't want to commingle my role with an area that some people would consider non-traditional when it comes to ag. But one thing that we are doing in my state is working with our prison population, and for those who meet the minimum requirements, we're teaching them how to work on farms. Some of these locations have several thousand acres. They're growing food for the hungry in my state. And so when they leave, they may have basic knowledge about agronomy. They may be able to know how to safely operate equipment, which continues to be an issue. A lot of farmers are not very trusting of new farm hands when it comes to getting on the new John Deere. And so we want to make sure that we help provide these folks an opportunity. But I'm not exactly sure if we should commingle the issues, though.
All right, let's shift gears to a bit of a different topic here. Looking more broadly at passing that land on to the next generation. The question asks, how big of an impediment to getting and keeping those young farmers is the estate or the death tax? But I'll ask more broadly, what role does tax reform play here in trying to get that next generation of agriculturalists to stay on the farm and stay actively involved without taking too big of a tax hit in the process?
It plays a huge role. It plays an absolutely huge role in any business. And so as farmers, we can enjoy some tax benefits, there's absolutely no doubt. But at the same time, when a farm grows to a certain level, it becomes a corporation. And I'm proud to say that while my farm is a family farm first, it's a C Corp, because we've grown to the size where that was necessary for us to limit our liability in some aspects of our farm. So when we did that, we had to learn how to work that tax code. And it's quite tricky. And our CPA does quite well on us every year. And I'm sad to say that, but it's a necessity. And reform is some kind of necessity, but it goes back to education. Because I talk to farmers all the time. I have friends of mine that call me and say, what would you do in my situation? And I tell them, get a good CPA that you can trust. Because that comes down to it. And when they can educate you and you can make better business decisions on your farm, because it's not just trusting that guy that you're putting in that John Deere tractor. It's the fact that that tractor costs you $250,000. I don't trust myself with it. So it's a bigger issue than, like you said, just the estate tax. It's total tax reform and getting down to the nuts and bolts of what can we do to make operating easier in a business environment.
One thing that we do, I've mentioned this fund that Kentucky has administered with our former tobacco money. For our young farmers, a lot of times we require a mentorship program before you can receive the fund. Sometimes it's like cost share to help pay for part of a hoop barn or for forage storage. And before you're eligible, you have to not just sit down at an extension office and listen to an extension agent explain what you can do with this new technology, but they actually assign you a farmer in that community, and you sit down, you bring your spreadsheets, you go through it with your other classmates, and people may come out of that with a little bit more knowledge and sophistication when it comes to financial planning for their farms. But in fact, this program started in a little area called Washington County, Kentucky, and we have got 15 young farmers who are involved, and each one of them have a mentor, and they are increasing their productivity because they're being placed with somebody who was there in the 80s, who knows how to balance a spreadsheet. And again, when it goes back to succession planning, I hate to beat a dead horse, but that is just such a huge issue with so many farmers who have not identified who's going to take over. But I always tell people that the next best thing to having a will is to be in somebody else's.
So cross your fingers, everyone, I suppose. Next question I'm going to direct towards Krista, but the rest of you can certainly feel free to chime in on it. The questioner, she and her husband are beginning farmers. They were looking to take advantage of the FSA Beginning Farmer Loan Program, but the provision in there requiring 90 days between beginning of the process and the funds being available, they had a seller that was not willing to give them 90 days. So they thus lost out on the opportunity. So I guess their question was, why does it take so long to complete the process, and is there any, or should there be any, flexibility on that 90-day window?
This is a tough one because I don't work for a USDA anymore, so I'm going to just push it right back on the agency. But I would certainly hope that there is flexibility. I mean, there are deadlines, there are things that are in law, there are things that are administrative. I don't know this one specifically, but I would certainly hope that there would be some flexibility if there are things out of your control that could help someone that's that close and has that kind of opportunity to be able to get some relief. So I wish I could answer it more specifically, but I don't want to speak for the department anymore. Thank you.
Fair enough then. We are looking at a hard stop here in about a minute or two, so I'd like to extend this opportunity to any of you. 15 or 30 seconds of closing thoughts about what it's going to take to bring a new generation of farmers and ranchers back to rural America. I'll start with you, Commissioner Quarles.
Well, I think we need to have a mind shift when it comes to developing a pipeline of those who want to be interested and be inspired to be in agriculture. And it starts at a very young age. It starts through our 4-H programs, FFA, mentorship programs, developing a system where we know who's going to take over the next farm. And a lot of times, it's the young folks that can save family farms. I know of a dairy industry's suffering in my state where this farmer had 3 college-age girls come back to the farm. It's profitable again. They installed a robotic milker. They're selling ice cream. They've started adding value to a product that previously they didn't. And his children saved his family farm, and that's a success story. But at the end of the day, I think that it's going to have to require access to capital, management plans, but also the ability to look at new crops. And one thing we're doing in Kentucky is that we're exploring industrial hemp. We'll have 12,000 acres of it this year. We're looking at hops with a growing beer industry. There's over 6,000 craft breweries in the United States now, and you can grow hops in a lot of our states that traditionally haven't done it. So we're trying to connect farmers with emerging markets, and it's usually a little bit easier to work with the millennials because they're a little bit more open to new ideas and also willing to take that risk.
Travis, closing thoughts?
I was here in D.C. about 2 weeks ago, and I visited a ton of offices on the Hill, me and some beet brethren, some sugar beet guys. We presented a united front to tell these people on the Hill how much the sugar program meant to us. And it's not only the sugar program, but it's strong farm policies. If we have those strong farm policies, it'll lead to development in rural America, because a strong farm is rural America. Without those things, I'm fairly certain that my boys won't be able to farm. And we need to realize, and we can also take a lot of pride in the fact that never before have this few people fed so many people. Our farmers are the most efficient in the world, and I'm quite proud to be in that bunch. And in closing, I would like to thank Agri-Pulse and everyone here, all the sponsors, everyone who sat here and listened to somebody like me straight off the farm come grab a microphone and give y'all my spiel. So I just want to thank y'all all for the opportunity to be here. It's been very great, and what a great panel.
Laura?
I'll join you in thanking this wonderful panel. It's really an honor to be here. I think for me, as we look at the programs within rural development and research particularly, in closing, I'd like to say I think we need to take a long view and a diverse view about how to get those programs working so that the money follows where there's future opportunity. Organic's included in that, but it's not limited to that. Those flagship loan and grant programs, making sure those dollars are directed towards things that we know work and can have maximum impact, as well as, find a way to not forget about the impactful programs that don't have baseline, like the value-added producer grants and the micro assistance loans and the organic research extension initiative. These are things that work, and they have a long view, and I think we have to make sure we not lose sight of those in the mix.
I agree with what everybody said here, but I think it also goes beyond that. We talk to ourselves a lot in agriculture, and this is a great panel and a great discussion among ourselves. And somehow or another, we have got to expand this conversation. This panel needs to go on the road. I'm not volunteering to go on the road, but panels like this need to be talking to, to urban and suburban folks, need to be going to not just 4-H and FFA, which I support and love dearly, and so does DuPont, but also Girls and Boys Clubs and other organizations that work with young people who are making career decisions. It's talking about kids to come back to your own farm or coming back to your own community, but it's got to be more than that. And we're comfortable having this conversation with each other. We're all nodding. I saw you all nod the whole time. But, we need to have tougher questions. We need to have tough folks pressing us as an industry about what we're doing to really make the path and the gateway for someone to come back in agriculture or to come to agriculture for the very first time. So my challenge to all of us is to have this conversation where it's not as easy, it's not as comfortable, where our audience does not understand what we're talking about is clearly, and we don't all agree. So I think we have opportunity with some challenges as well.
Certainly an interesting conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists.